2 weeks ago, Philip Hammond, the Tory Chancellor, introduced a budget promising the beginning of the end of the era of austerity. Now, I'm not quite sure whether he was consciously evoking Churchill's El Alamein speech, which actually was 76 years ago yesterday, about this not being the end or even the beginning of the end or perhaps the end of the beginning. I can't do the accent, but you get the point. The point is that it's not. The Institute of Fiscal Studies a few weeks ago reckoned that the British economy is 16% or £300 billion smaller than it would have been without the recession. For workers, it's been the worst decade for wages since Peterloo at the end of the Napoleonic Wars 200 years ago. The Trussell Trust, which organises over 400 food banks across the country, sees 650,000 people a year, 13% higher than 12 months ago. Millions fear the introduction of universal credit, a fear that could turn to anger, according to John Major and Gordon Brown. And in areas where universal credit has already been brought in, there's been a 52% rise in use of food banks. As a consequence of austerity, inadequate care systems, cuts to social services, growth in life expectancy has stalled, and in some areas of the country has begun to fall. So I'll believe that an era of austerity is coming to an end, not when a Tory Chancellor announces £1.5 billion of cuts in business rates to shops, but when there are no longer people sleeping rough in every second and third shop doorway in the towns and cities of this country. Exactly 5 years ago today, David Cameron made a speech in the Mansion House where he said that public spending cuts were necessary not as a temporary austerity, but to permanently slim down public services and to shrink the state. But not all welfare has been cut. The Tories claim that welfare payments amount to about £90 billion a year. But that's less than the £96 billion a year they pay out in corporate welfare, in low corporation taxes, other tax breaks to preserve and boost the profits of big business. The Chancellor may, in that speech, have announced an end to PFI deals when there were no more in the pipeline anyway, but it means little for the £10 billion a year that's still wasted on the 800 PFI deals that Labour and Tory governments have brought in over the last 25 years, many of which have been bought up by hedge funds and relocated to tax havens. They should all be renationalised. Hammond announced some ring-fenced one-offs of inadequate amounts for adult social care, high streets, potholes and education's little extras, as if £10,000 for primary school would get you more than about half a teaching assistant. But the Chancellor announced nothing to deal with the £6 billion a year funding gap faced by local councils over the next 2 years. One council, Northamptonshire County Council, effectively declared itself bankrupt earlier this year, and others could follow in East Sussex, Norfolk, Lancashire, Surrey and even Birmingham. But councils don't need to slash jobs and essential local services. They don't need to close libraries. They don't need to close nurseries, youth clubs and community centres. Labour councils alone, and there are 125 of them across Britain, control combined budgets of almost £79 billion. They hold about £14 billion of various reserves. Their combined spending power is greater than the GDP of 9 EU countries or the state budgets of 16. They're not an inconsequential political or economic force. If the political will was there, no Labour council needs meekly to make Hammond's cuts. They could use reserves and borrowing powers to generate resources for no-cuts budgets. Then they could launch a coordinated campaign to force the Tory government to increase funding to local councils to match local communities' needs. Now, earlier this year, the Guardian's Polly Toynbee reckoned if the Tory-controlled Local Government Association massed the ranks of their councils to oppose the cuts, their political power would be unstoppable. And we agree with Polly. Even more so for Labour councils. Now, seeing the need for a genuine anti-austerity party, one in action as well as one in words, led Bob Crow, the late General Secretary of the Transport Union, the RMT, to work with Socialists, particularly the Socialist Party, to set up TUSC at the beginning of 2010. Interestingly, what prefaced the actual setting up of TUSC was a conference hosted by the RMT 2 months earlier, where the speakers taking part in a discussion about what to do about the crisis of working class political representation, alongside myself, was Bob Crow, was Joe Higgins, Paul's predecessor as the Socialist Party of Ireland's MEP, the FBU General Secretary, Matt Rack, and one Jeremy Corbyn. It's well worth taking a long look at the TUSC website, where there's a very useful history of the conferences, meetings and campaigns that TUSC subsequently organised. It's an impressive list. Over those 8 years, TUSC had been a model of how an inclusive coalition of working class organisations could work together. Trade unionists, community campaigners, socialists from different parties and from none have stood against pro-austerity establishment politicians under a common banner and an agreed platform of core policies. TUSC has a tremendous record over those 8 years. Around 2,500 candidates stood on behalf of TUSC, polling around 375,000 votes between them. There was a tremendous intervention in the 2015 elections, in the general election where we stood 135 parliamentary candidates, and in the council elections where over 600 local council candidates were stood. We were the 6th biggest party in those elections, though given the paucity of media coverage, you'd be forgiven for not necessarily knowing that. But shortly after that election, Jeremy was elected as Labour's leader. And in the following general election of 2017, TUSC's steering committee agreed not to stand any parliamentary candidates, but instead to work all out to try and get Jeremy Corbyn into number 10 Downing Street. Now, that would still be the case if the current splits and arguments within the Tory party resulted in a snap general election now. All the component parts of TUSC remain firmly committed to continuing the fight against austerity policies and the politicians from whichever party implement them. But, unfortunately, there is no longer unanimous agreement on the steering committee as to whether those campaigns should continue to extend to challenging right-wing Labour councillors at the ballot box in next May's local elections. TUSC will continue to publish detailed information on council reserves, and will shortly start work on a survey across England and Wales, council by council, of budget cuts planned for next year. TUSC will continue to publish guidance material on how to prepare no-cuts people's budgets based on the needs of local communities. But the TUSC National Steering Committee, which met last Wednesday, heard from the lay representatives of the RMT that the union were unable to commit to authorising TUSC candidates in next year's elections in the way it had in the past. It remains the case, however, that a substantial majority of Labour councillors, particularly on Labour-led authorities, hold to the politics of Tony Blair, of a pro-market austerity being an unfortunate necessity, of there being no alternative. They're part not of the break with that Blairite past which Jeremy Corbyn represents, but a continuation of it. Later this month, every council in the country will publish a pre-budget report prior to around 6 weeks or so of consultation on the job services and essential support they intend to cut from next April. I think every branch should get a copy of their local report and discuss it as part of preparing for next year's elections. Election campaigns are not won based on 3 weeks' work in April. Anti-austerity votes gained on Thursday, May the 2nd, 2019, will be based on a record of campaigning and activity. And where that record doesn't already exist, it needs months of campaigning to make even the smallest dent in the idea that pro-austerity councillors are the only ideas worth listening to. So if we, the Socialist Party, are not prepared to give right-wing Blairite councillors free run next May, and we're not, we have to start now using our own electoral logo, Socialist Alternative, as the banner under which to fight. We respect the RMT's decision, but the future of essential local services and the working class families who rely on them are too important to let thousands of more jobs be lost, wages and conditions of council workers to deteriorate, and the threat to libraries, nurseries, youth clubs and community centres to go unchallenged. So to finish, Philip Hammond is no Churchill. Margaret Thatcher, nearly, Theresa May is no Margaret Thatcher. I was doing so well, wasn't I? In 1983, the year I was first elected to Parliament, Margaret Thatcher had a majority of 144. Yet a determined campaign in the mid-1980s by Liverpool City Council, politically inspired by the militant forerunner of today's Socialist Party, beat Thatcher and the Tories and won millions of pounds of extra funding sufficient to build thousands of new council houses and open schools, sports centres and parks. If Labour councillors today had the spirit of Liverpool and Lambeth, the spirit of Claycross and Poplar, if Jeremy and John MacDonald were to demand that local Labour councils use their resources and powers to implement no-cuts budgets in exchange for a mass campaign of trade unionists and working class communities to demand the government fully funds the needs of local communities, then this weak Tory government, not with a majority of 144, but with a shaky majority of 13, which may not even last the next 7 days, could be forced into an early general election. And Jeremy's radical agenda of a £10 an hour minimum wage, an end to tuition fees, a crash house building programme, public ownership of rail, of post, of water and of energy. That could take the first steps to begin the rejection of the last decade of austerity and the years of pro-market economics which preceded it. A fighting stance by Labour councillors and councils, a determined lead from the top of Labour, coordinated resistance from the trade union movement could increase the pressure for the Tory government to go. The beginning of the end of austerity could be in sight, but councillors who are not prepared to fight should make way for socialist alternative candidates who will. Thanks for listening.